Hello and welcome back. This week we look at the period between World War I and World War II. The 20 years between both military conflicts was rife with disillusionment and anxiety as soldiers returned home from the brutal battlefields of World War I and tried to return to civilian society. The pessimism that had characterized the end of the Great War permeated societies across the world. The liberal order that had triumphed in the 19th century also came under deep scrutiny. Challenges arose to the social, political, and economic structures that identified liberalism. In Russia, a communist regime took hold, challenging the dominance of capitalist economics. In Italy and Germany, fascism arose to dominate national politics, establishing in both countries authoritarian dictatorships. The collapse of the world's most developed economies with the Great Depression only compounded the problem. These challenges to liberal order would continue to build, eventually leading the world back into military conflict. 20 years after the end of the Great War, World War II would prove much more destructive and claim 5 times as many lives. The challenges to liberal order were characterized by authoritarian governments, typically dictatorships. They were centered around structured political parties and strong single leaders. State power controlled public and private life. Actions, speech, even thought came under strict government scrutiny. The individual lost prominence in favor of the collective, whether the state, the nation, or class. This social-political model is well reflected in the text by the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini you will find in this week's readings. Fascism would emerge in the 1920s and 30s to become the third alternative in world politics between liberalism and communism. Its combination of nationalism and socialist corporatism allowed fascists to borrow from both capitalism and communism, while at the same time establishing itself as a singular yet viable alternative. Violence and intimidation would become its preferred form of political expression. Fascism was greatly influenced by the experience of the Great War. As you might remember, the brutality and high death rates of trench warfare had instilled a general sense of disillusionment among the soldiers that fought the war. However, there were those that glorified the war experience. They saw in war the purest form of nationalism. The structured military life was disciplined and efficient in its functioning. On the other hand, civilian government was considered mediocre and inefficient. The solution to society's problems, these soldiers came to think, resided in the militarization of civilian society and politics. Political fascism first emerged in Italy, a country that had been on the winning side during World War I. Yet during the peace talks, Italy was not granted by the Big Three all the land it hoped to obtain from neighboring Austro-Hungary. The loss of 600,000 Italians fighting the war made the limited spoils seem a mutilated victory. Even in victory, there was a sense of disillusionment with the war. Overcoming this sense of disillusionment was the objective of the Partito Nazionale Fascista, led by Benito Mussolini. You see him in the picture here. Before the Great War, Mussolini had been a prominent socialist. However, he left the party when the leadership refused to support Italy's entrance into the war in 1915. Mussolini was strongly nationalistic and wanted to see Italy prove itself fighting against the heavyweights of Europe. He joined with other hyper-nationalists to found the fascist party. Italian fascism sought to remove class conflict through nationalism and social corporatism. In the disillusioned post-war period, fascism offered many Italians a message of strength and power. They wore militaristic uniforms and emulated military structure and discipline. This proved attractive to many of the young men that had fought in the war. By 1922, Mussolini's fascist party had enough followers to pressure its way into government, after 50,000 fascists marched on the Italian capital of Rome. 3 years later, Mussolini and the fascists had manipulated themselves into sole control of the government, effectively turning the Italian democracy into a dictatorship. A similar situation occurred in Germany, with the added element that Germany had actually lost the Great War. The defeat and the harsh conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles combined to give many Germans a feeling that they had been stabbed in the back. As soldiers returned home, they found it difficult to integrate into civilian life. High unemployment rates only contributed to the sense of disillusionment with civilian society. In the period immediately following the war, the lack of social stability and the fear of a communist revolt led many ex-combatants to form into what were known as Freikorps groups, loosely organized independent gangs of ex-soldiers that patrolled the streets of German cities to ensure public order. As you can see in the image here, they would typically wear their military uniforms and were armed with the rifles they had brought back from the front. Righting the wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles was the primary objective of the German National Socialist Workers' Party, a small political party that formed in Munich in 1919 and was made up of mainly ex-combatants. One of the first members was Adolf Hitler, an Austrian that had fought for Germany during the Great War. You see him here in this image. His great oratorical ability soon propelled him to the leadership of the National Socialist or Nazi Party. The Nazi political platform followed the fascist model. It was based on strong nationalism and the rebuilding of a strong Germany. However, the Nazis added a strong anti-Semitic racist element, which, as we will see, dominated all major conceptions within the movement. These anti-Semitic notions were clearly outlined in Adolf Hitler's autobiographical book, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which was written in 1923 while Hitler was in jail for leading a coup d'etat against the government. The Nazis grew in popularity as Germany dipped into economic crisis. After the collapse of the U.S. stock market in 1929, the industrialized world fell into what has come to be known as the Great Depression. Unemployment numbers skyrocketed as factories and banks closed around the world. Germany was hit especially hard. By 1933, over 6 million Germans were unemployed, most of them young men. It was within the context of these great difficulties that the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany. In the 1930 and 1932 elections, the Nazis ran on a program of building national unity and renewed economic strength. They offered themselves as a nationalist alternative to the growing influence of the Socialist Party. They also accused Jews of inciting the Great Depression and promised an end to Germany's economic troubles. The support Hitler and the Nazis gained from moneyed industrialists, afraid of a socialist revolution, led to the appointment of Hitler as Chancellor or Prime Minister of Germany in January of 1933. As had happened in Italy, the Nazis quickly manipulated the democratic political process to gain complete control of the government. Within a year, Hitler was dictator of Germany. I want to talk a little more about fascist ideology and goals. Both in Germany and Italy, fascism advocated strong state control, a corporatist structure that would allow the government to control the economy, politics, even society. The individual faded away in favor of the nation, the collective that made up the nation. Both Mussolini and Hitler would argue that the greatness of the nation required that the individual put aside selfishness or self-interest in order to become one with a larger national society. Thinking as one, society could achieve greatness. The expansion of the nation was the ultimate objective. How better to demonstrate greatness than by establishing an empire? Of course, physical expansion required violence and war, which, as you might remember from past weeks, was the ultimate expression of devotion to the nation, at least as it had been expressed prior to the Great War. To ensure the devotion to the nationalist cause, fascists believe in the militarization of society. As you can see here, Hitler is overseeing Nazi party members parading past in a public display of strength. Notice all the party members are wearing militaristic uniforms. In fact, the use of flags, banners, uniforms, and military marches was central to the fascist aesthetic. Notice all the party members are wearing militaristic uniforms. In fact, the use of flags, banners, uniforms, and military marches was central to the fascist aesthetic. Fascists celebrated masculinity and masculine dominance in society. Men were considered the representation of human perfection because they were seen as strong and valorous. Here you have a Nazi propaganda poster that presents a romanticized image of a strong German male. Look at his straight face and angled jaws. This, together with his muscular arms, was typical of Nazi propaganda posters. Interestingly enough, though, the man you see here is stocking boxes of canned food. In the mind of Hitler, this too contributed to a strong nation. There was one unique characteristic of German fascism, or Nazism, and that was racism. Whereas Italian fascism viewed the nation as the union of all Italians, German Nazism understood the nation to be made up of only blonde and blue-eyed Aryans in Germany. As such, Nazis believed in the separation of those they considered racially superior from those that they labeled inferior. For Hitler, social class distinctions were not as important as racial distinctions. Here you have two Nazi posters. The one on the left, you can see the Jewish, we'll discuss this in a second, but the Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. Out of the Jewish mouth comes the Soviet Union, Uncle Sam, and also the British Lion. On the right, you see a poster of a movie put together by the Nazi propaganda ministry about the Jewish threat. And you can see just in the way that the faces are drawn on the poster, the negative depiction of Jews in Nazi propaganda posters. Hitler was very heavily influenced by social Darwinism and modern racist theories that we have seen in the past weeks. And with that, he injected Nazism with a strong belief in race as the basic building block of society. In Mein Kampf, Hitler argued that racial mixing led to mediocrity because it lowered the higher race, in this case the German Aryans, leading to physical and intellectual regression. As such, Hitler argued, society and race should be segregated to ensure that the racially superior groups remained superior. Those Germans that were deemed proper Aryans joined what was known as the Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community. This group was to be protected and cared for. Those that fell outside were labeled the asozial, or asocial, or outside of society. They were the biological outsiders. This group included Jews, homosexuals, the mentally handicapped, and gypsies, among others. If these groups were not segregated, they would intermix with the Aryans and weaken the Aryan racial purity, making it possible for the racially inferior, according to Hitler, to take over society. A society that Hitler claimed would be one of mediocrity. Hitler especially disliked Jews. This was not because he thought that they were at the bottom of the racial ladder. He did not. He actually thought Jews were intelligent enough to plot conspiracies to take over the world. In Hitler's eyes, then, the conflict between Aryans and Jews was one over world dominance. Because of their racial superiority, Hitler believed that the Aryans deserved to control the world. However, the Jews threatened this dominance. It was this that made them so dangerous to Hitler. Once in power, Nazis imposed legislation that made racial segregation official in Germany. In 1933, just months after taking over, Hitler demanded that all Germans boycott Jewish businesses in an attempt to force them into bankruptcy. This was followed in 1935 by the notorious Nuremberg laws, which stripped German Jews of German nationality and prohibited Jews from hiring non-Jews to work for them. This would undermine, in Nazi eyes, the racial superiority of Aryans over Jews. Ironically enough, German Jews had felt very identified with their country, and many had fought in the Great War in defense of their nation. In November of 1938, Nazi gangs destroyed what few Jewish businesses were left in Germany during Reichskristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. You see an image of the damage caused by that night on your right. On the left, you see German Jews wearing the yellow stars of David on their clothing, another result of Nazi segregation. As we will see next time, the Nazi obsession with Aryan world domination did not stop with Jewish exclusion. In 1939, German troops marched into neighboring Poland as part of a larger plan to conquer land in Eastern Europe for Aryans to populate. With it began the most destructive war in human history. Only 20 years after the Great War, World War II was far more devastating, killing 5 times as many people. We will deal with the war next time. So see you then.